Defining and writing learning outcomes is one of the foundations of course design. It's also very hard to do well. Why? Because writing learning outcomes requires you to really grasp the learning process from the student's point of view. It also requires using language in a precise way to define outcomes that can actually be learned and achieved. Let's look at an example. Let's say we're teaching Comp 1 and we start out, we're doing our Project 5, and we decide we need to define our project learning goals. And the first one is this: understand the fundamental concepts of rhetoric. I have written many learning outcomes like that. Most of my learning outcomes start like that. What happens if we share that learning outcome with Julie Dirksen and her instructional design crew? What she says is, this is a learning objective pretty much guaranteed to make a formally trained instructional designer's head explode. Why? Well, it says here, understand. Seriously, how do you think you just recognize when they just magically understand? Give me something I can measure, right? It's not like there's a magic little light bulb that goes off on the student's head and we can see, oh, they understand. So we need to take a step back. As Dirksen herself says in Chapter 3, I'm drawing some of this presentation from her Chapter 3 on defining learning goals. Dirksen says there are actually a number of problems with this learning objective, but let's start with the use of the word understand. It's a totally reasonable place to start. Of course we want our learners to understand, but there's no visible way to see if someone understands. It's hard to design for something as fuzzy as understand, so we need to define it more. So she goes on to say that one way people get around this is by using doing words in their learning objectives. So I'm going to do just that. Transform that first learning objective into these three. Students will be able to explain the value of rhetorical concepts. The doing word there is explain. The second one, students will be able to describe the proper use of rhetorical appeals. Again, the action word there, the doing word, describe. The third one, students will be able to define and describe the use of rhetorical appeals, such as ethos, pathos, and logos. Now, I'm feeling like I'm starting to make a little progress with my learning outcomes. But again, Dirksen is pretty hard on us, and she says, of course, this is a hedge. It doesn't really get you around the problem unless you are having people memorize and recite definitions. In fact, it's almost as difficult to determine if they can define something as it is to know if they can understand something. Besides, you don't actually care if they can define it. You want to know if they can do it. Now, in our case, I might actually care quite a bit. I might want students to define ethos, pathos, and logos and work with some definitions of those concepts. So I do kind of want them to define. But her larger point is that you don't care if they can define it. You want to know if they can do it. So she challenges us to take our learning outcome and think in terms of what do we want students to really do? And since we have a project that we've already written and we know that that's the end point of our journey, let's look at our project. So we can say this: what we really want our students to do is compose a slide presentation that uses rhetorical concepts to analyze a visual text. Now we're getting somewhere, right? That's tangible. Compose a slide presentation, use rhetorical concepts, analyze a visual text. So now I'm beginning to feel like I've moved from this fuzzy goal to something that's much more precise and more active. Now what we can do is put some interpretive pressure on the language of this learning outcome and begin breaking it down. So we could take each word in this statement. For example, the word compose. So let's say we want to spend a little time talking about compose. We might ask ourselves, are we at the beginning of the semester or the end? Do students understand? Have we been using the word compose? Have we defined the process of, invention, revision, the whole composing process? Are they familiar with that? If not, we might want to spend some time, talking about what is composition, understand the steps of the process. Composition involves beginning with an idea, organizing your ideas, drafting, revising, and so forth. So even just that word compose could lead to a couple weeks worth of content where we talk about the composing process. Slide presentation. Have they done a slide presentation before? Do they know what one is? Maybe we give some examples. We talk about the genre. We talk about slide presentations are really common in workplace writing because we need to give a presentation to a live audience and sort of define the conventions of that genre. So again, the word slide presentation opens onto a couple of weeks worth of content where we talk about the genre, conventions, and rhetorical situations around a slide presentation. Similarly, rhetorical concepts, that's where we started, remember? So maybe we really do want to teach ethos, pathos, and logos and help students understand how to use them. So we might take a step back and say, let's define them. Now let's practice explaining them. Now let's move on to applying them. And now we're going to use them to analyze a visual text. Likewise, analyze. Have we defined that yet? Have we taught students what an analysis is and why it's important? We might want to spend some time talking about that. And then finally, of course, visual text. This may be the first time they've encountered visual and multimodal texts, so maybe we want to take a step back and talk about what are some examples of a visual text. Might be an advertisement, might be a public service announcement, might be a billboard, might be, who knows what, might be a graphic novel, could be any kinds of things. But what we've done is really find a way to begin using that big, lumpy, sort of module level outcome, compose a slide presentation that uses rhetorical concepts into visual text. That's a big one. And break it down into the keywords and think about how each of those keywords in our original outcome could be part of a way of thinking about breaking down our unit. Now, what Dirksen does, and I think this is really, really helpful, and I encourage you to adopt this process. She says, as you're defining your learning outcomes, ask yourself these two questions. Is this something a learner would actually do? And can I tell when they've done it? And if you apply those as you're working through your learning outcomes and kind of mapping out your weekly plan, I think you will find that your outcomes get a lot crisper and a lot more tangible and a lot more clearly defined. So is this something a learner would really do? Composing a slide presentation? Heck yes, it's something they're going to have to do all the time. So it passes that test. Can I tell when they've done it? Well, yeah, you could define a rubric around the keywords that we were just looking at. So we're beginning to improve our original learning outcome in some really tangible ways. Now, one thing that Dirksen suggests that we think about is Bloom's taxonomy, and many of you have probably encountered this before. It's a familiar teaching tool used in educational psychology and instructional design, and Bloom's taxonomy, this is only a piece of it, and it's a simplified piece of it, but it's a way of distinguishing levels of cognitive sophistication from the basics, which in our list are at the top. Remember and understand. Do you have basic recall? Do you understand the definition of the term? Then you move into applying and analyze. Can you apply that idea? Can you analyze something? And then the top level, if you think of this as a kind of pyramid, the top level of the pyramid is to evaluate and create. So in this case, as we move down the list, we actually move from the foundations of remembering and understanding to the higher level cognitive sophistication of creating and evaluating. So in some cases, you can actually design a learning outcome or a learning unit to move through this sequence, beginning with the basics of memory and understanding on through apply, analyze, evaluate, and create. And on the course website, I posted a really useful resource called Bloom's Taxonomy Revised that shows a little bit about how to do this. But here's an example. Dirksen says, let's apply Bloom's taxonomy to the principles of the design principles, contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. Some of you have been talking about that in the discussion, the CRAP. She says, let's say, how are we going to apply Bloom's taxonomy to these design principles? So on the left-hand column, we have the idea of remember. What is some way that the learner might do this? Well, they might tell somebody what the acronym is and what each item stands for. CRAP stands for contrast, repetition, alignment, proximity. To understand, you might ask the learner to explain what each principle means. What do you mean by contrast? What do you mean by repetition? And so forth. And they're beginning to say, I can explain it, and it means this. And as they explain it, they're moving into from just remembering it at a superficial level to understanding it. Then you might ask them to apply these four terms by organizing the elements of a web page using the four principles. You might ask them to analyze, look at a print advertisement, and explain how each of the four principles is being used in the design. Evaluate, expertly critique several different advertisements based on their use of the four principles. And then finally, create a web or a print or web layout from scratch. Now you can see here, we're still just basically defining our learning outcomes, but look at how there's an architecture there. We've kind of built a learning unit that would actually end up, in this case, with a web layout or a print layout from scratch that is designed to demonstrate the learner's expertise in understanding of these design principles. So it turns out to be pretty darn powerful. And I mentioned this resource called Bloom's Taxonomy Revised Keywords, Model Questions, and Instructional Strategies, which was put together from the Office of Professional Development at Indiana University, Purdue University at Indianapolis, also known as UWI-PUI. And in that document, they map each of the 5 levels of the Bloom's taxonomy onto a series of verbs that will help you break it down. And I find this really useful to kind of have printed out and sitting next to my desk as I'm writing learning outcomes. So the left column suggests active verbs that you can use to define the learning outcomes at each level of the taxonomy. In our case, understand. Since we've said understanding is too fuzzy, don't write a learning outcome around understanding, but you can instead use a verb like classify, defend, demonstrate, distinguish, explain, express, extend, and so forth. So those verbs help you translate something mushy into something active. The model questions in the middle column suggest different kinds of questions you could give as student prompts, or you can use to assess student learning. So for example, if you're asking students to define ethos, pathos, logos, you might say, state in your own words a definition of the rhetorical appeals. Explain in your own words why they're useful and why they're important. Explain what they mean. So those model questions can actually help you define activities and assessments at each step of your outcome process. And then along the right-hand column are some instructional strategies that you can use to actually teach these concepts. For example, here we have summarize and paraphrase. You might ask a student to summarize a reading or paraphrase a reading that will help them to kind of dive into understanding definitions of a term. So this is only one section of the document. It goes all the way through the taxonomy at each level, but I find it really, really useful, and I've used it for many years when revising my own learning outcomes, and also when working with textbook authors and with online instructors to help them revise their LOs. Now, Dirksen also talks about this concept of proficiency. Do you want your learners to have basic knowledge, or do you want them to have the ability to do something more sophisticated? Do you want them to master a skill to the extent that it becomes almost unconscious? And in our case, we want them to be moving somewhat from left to right. So she provides a nice chart in her chapter 3, and this is a reproduction of that chart here, where she maps Bloom's taxonomy of cognitive sophistication on the left vertical axis against this other taxonomy of proficiency across the bottom. And she provides this chart as a way of thinking about the design of a course or unit as a kind of two-dimensional map. So in this case, we've located the goal with this red X. The goal here is the learner should be able to analyze electrical schematics correctly with resources and support materials. Now, you could use this same tool to kind of map your learning unit, moving from lower left to upper right, beginning with memory and familiarization. Toward the end, you may not quite be at unconscious competence, but you definitely want to get to the level of proficiency with an ability to create something. So by the end of our unit, for example, we want our students to have a reasonable proficiency with presenting a slide presentation that analyzes a visual text. So it's a fairly complex project. I think it's a lot to cover in 4 weeks, but we begin in the lower left and move toward the upper right, defining students toward a particular goal. So this map, I think, really helps to show how starting with learning outcomes can help you as an instructor to design an outcome that's actually going to lead students in some positive direction toward a specific goal. Now, this process of defining and organizing learning outcomes really is the foundation of effective course design for a unit or for an entire course, or in fact, an entire curriculum. So that's why the learning outcomes are at the top of that chart in Project 5. I think we have to start there first. You have to define those, break them out week by week, then everything else is much easier to organize around them. But again, this is relatively hard. I'm going to push you in your Projects 5s to really be pretty precise about this. And so use that Dirksen chapter and use the learning outcomes UWI-PUI statement to help get crisp, and try this out and see what you think. I think you'll find it a really useful strategy for defining those learning outcomes and getting them to a point where they're actually useful to you and to your students. All right, thanks for listening.